It is the first story, the origin point from which all of Western consciousness flows. We know its cadence by heart, the breath of God on dust, the pristine innocence of a garden, the whisper of a serpent, the taste of forbidden fruit, and the final terrible echo of a closing gate. The story of Adam and Eve is so foundational, so deeply embedded in our culture, that it feels as solid and unchanging as bedrock. But have you ever read it and felt a strange sense of temporal vertigo? A feeling that you are watching a series of disconnected snapshots, not a continuous film. We see them in the garden, a timeless, placeless paradise. But how long were they there? Did the fall happen in an afternoon, a year, a lifetime? The text is utterly silent, giving us no sense of scale, no rhythm to their life in perfection. Then, cast out into the harsh reality of a cursed earth, they have two sons, Cain and Abel. And after the first murder, the Bible meticulously traces the lineage of Cain and then the righteous line of Seth. But what about the other half of humanity? Genesis 5:4 adds an almost dismissive footnote, and he had other sons and daughters. Other daughters, who were they? What were their names? What role did they play in the founding of the human race? The narrative sweeps past these questions as if they are unimportant. We are left with a portrait of the first family that is curiously incomplete. A genealogy with all the female branches pruned away. A story without a clock. For centuries, we have been taught to accept this ambiguity as part of the text's sacred, mythic quality. But what if this vagueness is not a feature, but a flaw? What if the story feels like a summary, because it is a summary? What if we are reading a diary from which someone has ripped out all the pages with dates and censored the names of half the family members? The silence in Genesis about the timeline of Eden and the identity of Eve's daughters is not the silence of reverence. It has the distinct feel of redaction. It is the silence of a story that has been deliberately simplified, sanitized, and stripped of its most challenging and human details. To find the missing pages from Adam and Eve's diary, we must once again turn away from the sanctioned, streamlined narrative and open the scroll that remembers what history was forced to forget. We must consult the Heavenly Chronicle, the Book of Jubilees, where Genesis offers a timeless portrait. Jubilees provides a detailed, day-by-day ledger, where Genesis is silent on the daughters. Jubilees records their names and their destinies. It does not just supplement the story, it restores its missing dimensions of time and family, and its testimony is immediate and shocking. The Book of Jubilees does not allow for ambiguity. It states with the precision of a celestial scribe that Adam lived in the Garden of Eden for 7 full years before the transgression. It even breaks down that timeline he was created, brought into the garden, and for 7 years he learned, worked, and guarded it. The book then reveals that Eve was created at the end of that first 7-year cycle. They were together in the garden for only a short time before the serpent came, a detail that adds a layer of poignant tragedy to their fall. But the revelations do not stop with time. The book systematically fills in the censored branches of the family tree. It tells us that after Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's first daughter was born, and her name was Awan. Then came another daughter, Azura. It continues to list the births of their children, giving us not just a vague mention of other sons and daughters, but a full, functioning genealogy. It restores the identities of the women who were systematically erased from the official record, transforming them from a statistical footnote into named, historical individuals. This is the core of our investigation. Genesis gives us a mythic, almost abstract story of the beginning. Jubilees gives us a life with a timeline, a family, a rhythm. This forces us to ask the most critical question: why would these foundational details be removed? What was so dangerous about revealing that Adam and Eve lived in paradise for a specific, perfect period of 7 years? And why was it so important to the gatekeepers of history to hide the names of their daughters, to render the first mothers of humanity anonymous? The answers reveal a deliberate attempt to shape our understanding of the beginning of the world, a choice to favor a simpler, cleaner, and ultimately a more patriarchal story over a complex and complete one. The revelation that Adam and Eve lived in the garden for a specific period of 7 years is more than just a piece of historical trivia. It is a theological bombshell, a detail so charged with symbolic meaning that its removal from Genesis feels like a deliberate act of censorship. In the sacred numerology of the ancient world, and especially in Hebrew thought, the number 7 is the fingerprint of God. It is the number of divine completion, perfection, and covenant. The world was created in 7 days. The Sabbath is the 7th day. The sacred calendar is built on cycles of 7. 7 is the rhythm of holiness. By stating that Adam's time in the garden was a perfect 7-year cycle, the Book of Jubilees transforms our understanding of what Eden was. It was not a timeless, undefined state of being. It was a specific, divinely ordained period of perfection. This means their fall was not just a tragic mistake in an undefined once upon a time. It was the catastrophic interruption of a perfect 7-year Sabbath, a shattering of a divinely established cycle of completion. The sin was not just disobedience, it was chronological sabotage. This specific timeline also adds a layer of profound tragedy to the story. It means Adam had 7 years to walk with God, to learn the rhythms of the garden, to understand the divine order. His transgression was not the mistake of a naive newborn, but the deliberate choice of a being who had experienced 7 years of uninterrupted communion with his Creator. He knew exactly what he was losing. So why would this crucial detail be removed? To make the story timeless is to make it feel more like a myth or a parable. But to anchor it to a specific 7-year period makes it feel like history. It grounds the story in a tangible reality, with a beginning, a middle, and a tragic end. The gatekeepers of the text may have preferred the mythic quality, the ambiguity that allows for more flexible interpretation. Furthermore, the idea of a completed 7-year cycle in Eden being broken by sin introduces a powerful and perhaps uncomfortable theological pattern. It suggests that human history is a story of constantly falling short of divine completion. It establishes a 7-year itch at the very dawn of creation, a tendency for humanity to break the covenant just as it reaches its point of perfection. By removing the number, the scribes removed the pattern. They gave us a story about a single fall, but they hid the deeper, more unsettling truth that this fall was a disruption of a perfect, divine cycle. The 7 years in Eden were not just a measure of time, they were a measure of what was lost. The revelation of a 7-year timeline in Eden immediately begs the next question: what was Adam doing for all that time? The Genesis account is famously sparse, stating only that he was placed in the garden to work it and take care of it. This leaves us with the image of a simple, idyllic life, a divine gardener tending to a perfect landscape. But the Book of Jubilees suggests a purpose far deeper and more profound. It implies that Eden was not just a home, it was a school. Adam was not just a caretaker, he was a student. According to the theological framework of Jubilees, where the law is eternal, Adam's 7 years in the garden were a period of divine instruction. This was not a time of passive, blissful ignorance. It was an intensive, one-on-one tutorial with the Creator of the universe. It is in this context that Jubilees asserts that Adam was taught the ordinances of the heavens, the divisions of the year, and the sanctity of the Sabbath. He was, in effect, the first high priest, learning the cosmic liturgy directly from God. The garden was his seminary. This single powerful idea changes our entire perception of the fall. The sin of eating from the tree of knowledge was not merely the violation of a single, seemingly arbitrary rule. It was an act of academic treason. It was the ultimate student rebellion. Adam, after receiving 7 years of direct instruction from the source of all truth, chose to seek a shortcut to knowledge from a forbidden, external source. The serpent did not just offer a piece of fruit, he offered a competing curriculum. And now we see another powerful motive for why this timeline and its implications were erased. By portraying Adam as a simple, naive gardener, the Genesis account softens the severity of his sin. His disobedience seems more like a tragic mistake born of innocence. But the Adam of Jubilees is no innocent. He is a highly educated student, a being who had been personally instructed in the divine order of the cosmos. His choice, therefore, was not a stumble in the dark. It was a deliberate act of intellectual and spiritual betrayal. He rejected his divine teacher in favor of a liar. This makes the fall far more culpable, far more tragic, and far less excusable. The gatekeepers, perhaps in a desire to make the first man more sympathetic, or to avoid the complex theological idea that the law existed before Sinai, chose to edit out his education. They gave us the story of a fallen gardener, but they hid the more profound and damning story of a fallen scholar. They hid the truth that Eden was not just a paradise lost, but a school that was abandoned. The meticulous detail with which Jubilees reconstructs the early timeline of Adam and Eve, the precise 7 years in Eden. The angelic instruction also highlights a glaring omission in the Genesis narrative. Genesis provides Adam with his early life and purpose, but when it comes to the founding of humanity beyond Cain and Abel, it becomes frustratingly vague, mentioning only that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. The Book of Jubilees, however, refuses to let these first women remain nameless. It names Cain's wife as Awan and Seth's wife as Azura. It doesn't just give them names, it places them within the lineage, describing their marriages, their children, and their roles in the burgeoning human society. This information isn't presented as speculation or legend. It's woven into the chronological fabric of the text, treated as factual history. This is where we uncover another crucial motive for the scribes' censorship. In a patriarchal society, and especially in the later codification of law that followed the Sinaitic covenant. The roles and genealogies of women were often marginalized. The law of Moses, while providing spiritual guidelines for women, did not always elevate their status in legal or societal structures. To admit that the very first marriages, the very foundations of human civilization, involved unions between brothers and sisters, a practice strictly forbidden by later Mosaic law, would have been deeply problematic for the gatekeepers. By erasing the names of Awan and Azura, the scribes did more than just solve the "who did Cain marry" question. They effectively erased the female half of the foundational human population from the record. They simplified the story, removed the biological necessity of incest in the early generations, and presented a lineage that, at least on the surface, adhered more closely to the later legal and social norms they were trying to establish. This action served two purposes for the gatekeepers: avoiding the incest taboo. It sidestepped the uncomfortable truth that the very survival of humanity required acts that would later be deemed capital offenses. Reinforcing patriarchy. By erasing the female lineage, they reinforced a purely patriarchal narrative, where the important lineage is traced solely through the male line, from Adam to Seth, and so on. The mothers become invisible. The Book of Jubilees, in restoring these names, is not just providing historical detail, it is reclaiming the personhood and the essential, often overlooked, role of women in the very first family. It challenges the sanitized, male-centric history that has been passed down, reminding us that the story of humanity's beginning was not solely a story of men. The decision to erase the names of the first daughters was not a small act of editorial discretion. It was a foundational act of censorship that has had a long and pervasive legacy. By systematically removing Awan, Azura, and the other daughters of Eve from the official record, the gatekeepers did more than just simplify a messy genealogy. They male-washed the origin story of humanity, creating a narrative so overwhelmingly focused on the male lineage that the female half of the story is rendered almost entirely invisible. Think of the consequences. The story of Genesis, as we have it, is a story of fathers and sons. Adam, Cain, Abel, Seth. The lineage is meticulously traced from one man to the next. The women in this narrative are often present only as wives or mothers, their own stories and identities secondary to the men they are connected to. This pattern, established in the very first chapters, sets a precedent for much of the Old Testament. While there are notable and powerful exceptions, the overarching narrative is one of a patriarchal history. The Book of Jubilees, by contrast, presents a more balanced, albeit still patriarchal, account. By simply giving the daughters names and recording their births and marriages alongside their brothers, it acknowledges their existence and their essential role. It does not allow them to be anonymous footnotes. It recognizes that for every Seth, there was an Azura. For every Cain, there was an Awan. Humanity was not built by fathers alone. It was built by families. The legacy of this male washing is a theological and cultural blind spot. It has contributed to centuries of interpretation where the role of women in God's plan is often seen as supportive rather than essential, passive rather than active. When the very first mothers of the human race are treated as so unimportant that their names are not even worth recording, it sends a powerful, albeit subtle, message. The scribes who made these edits may not have been acting out of overt misogyny, but out of a cultural bias that was common in their time. They were chronicling the history of a covenant that was passed down through the male line, and so they focused on the men. But in their focus, they created a distortion. They gave us a story of a father God and his chosen sons, but they hid the full story of the first families he created. Jubilees does not overthrow this patriarchal structure, but it does restore a measure of dignity and visibility to the women who were written out of their own history. It reminds us that the story of humanity was always meant to be a duet, even if, for centuries, we have only been allowed to hear one of the voices. So, who were the men who made these editorial decisions? Who were the gatekeepers who, when faced with the full, complex, and sometimes uncomfortable story of Adam and Eve, chose to give us a simplified, abbreviated, and censored version? They were not villains seeking to deceive. They were, in a sense, the first story simplifiers, theologians and scribes who believed their primary duty was to create a foundational narrative that was clear, powerful, and accessible. Their motive was not malice, but a pursuit of narrative efficiency. Imagine them as film editors, tasked with turning a sprawling multi-year epic into a concise 90-minute feature. They looked at the raw material, the ancient traditions that included detailed timelines, long genealogies with both sons and daughters, and complex theological concepts like a pre-Sinaitic law, and they made cuts. They believed that for the core message to shine through, the extraneous details had to be removed. The 7-year timeline in Eden. A fascinating detail, perhaps, but not essential to the core drama of the fall. The names of the daughters genealogically important, but they introduce the messy problem of incest and detract from the primary focus on the male lineage of the covenant. The idea of Adam being schooled in the garden. A powerful concept, but it complicates the traditional timeline of revelation. In their minds, they were not destroying the truth, they were distilling it. They were trimming the narrative fat to get to the theological meat. Their goal was to create an origin story that was easy to teach, easy to remember, and focused squarely on the foundational events: creation, the fall, the first murder, and the establishment of the righteous line of Seth. Everything else was secondary. This desire for simplicity is understandable. A clean, powerful story is often more impactful than a complex, detailed one. But in their zeal to simplify, they sacrificed something vital: reality. They traded the messy, detailed truth of a real family living through real time for a streamlined, almost mythic fable. They were not trying to hide a conspiracy. They were trying to tell a better, tighter story. But in doing so, they became the first redactors of sacred history, the men who decided that a simpler truth was preferable to the complete one, and we have been living with the consequences of their editorial choices ever since. The legacy of this curated, simplified story of Adam and Eve is a faith that often lacks a sense of historical texture and depth. By receiving an abridged version of our own origin, we have inherited a narrative that feels, at times, more like a parable than a history, more like a theological blueprint than the lived experience of our first ancestors. The first and most obvious consequence is a loss of clarity. The very questions that this video seeks to answer. How long were they in Eden? Who were the daughters exist only because of the scribes' decision to simplify. They traded detail for brevity, but in doing so, they created centuries of confusion, debate, and even doubt. The story they sought to make cleaner became, in many ways, less coherent. But the deeper legacy is a loss of relatability. The Adam and Eve of Genesis can feel like distant, almost abstract figures. Their lives in the garden are a timeless ideal, their sin a theological concept. But the Adam and Eve of Jubilees are people who lived within the confines of time. They had 7 years of peace. They had daughters with names. They had a family that was complex and messy. This level of detail makes them feel less like archetypes and more like ancestors. It breathes historical life into the theological drama. By removing these details, the story Simplifiers unintentionally made it harder for us to connect with our own origins. We lost the sense of a real family, living in a real place, for a real amount of time. The story became more mythic, but less human. We were given a powerful moral lesson, but we lost a tangible connection to the people who lived it. This sanitized summary has shaped our spiritual imagination. We tend to think of the big moments of faith, the call, the fall, the sacrifice, without appreciating the long, quiet years of living, learning, and family life that happen in between. The full story of Adam and Eve, as preserved in Jubilees, reminds us that sacred history is not just a series of dramatic events. It is the story of daily life, of passing seasons, of raising children, and of navigating a world where divine perfection and human fragility coexist. In summarizing the story, the gatekeepers gave us the headlines, but they hid from us the rich, detailed, and deeply human article that should have gone with them for centuries. We have been watching the theatrical release of the Adam and Eve story. It is the version we all know, the one that has been shown in every church, every Sunday school, every work of religious art. It is a powerful, essential, and beautiful film. But we now know, thanks to the preserved testimony of the Book of Jubilees, that what we have been watching is the edited version, the summary cut for a general audience. The director's cut has been locked away in the archives, but the archives have been opened. The rediscovery of these ancient texts is like finding the original film reels, complete with all the deleted scenes, the restored character arcs, and the original, uncut timeline. The choice is no longer in the hands of the ancient studio executives who decided which version to release. The choice, now, is yours. You have been shown the evidence. You know that there is a version of the story that includes the 7 years of peace in Eden, the divine schooling of Adam, and the named and honored daughters of Eve. You now stand at the entrance to the screening room, and you have 2 options. You can choose to be content with the theatrical version. It is a masterpiece in its own right, and it contains the core of the essential truth. There is no shame in preferring the familiar, streamlined story that has nourished faith for millennia. Or you can choose to watch the director's cut. You can choose to see the story as it was originally intended, in all its complex, detailed, and sometimes uncomfortable glory. You can choose to meet the characters not as archetypes, but as people who lived and breathed in a world with a tangible history. This is not about rejecting the story you know. It is about embracing the opportunity to experience it more fully, more deeply, and more completely. The story Simplifiers made their choice for you. Now, you get to make your own. Will you stay in your seat after the credits roll, or will you stay to watch the scenes they never wanted you to see? The purpose of uncovering the lost timeline and the forgotten daughters of Eve is not to undermine the Book of Genesis, but to breathe life back into it. It is an invitation to move beyond a mythic, two-dimensional portrait of our origins and to step into the rich, textured, and deeply human reality of the world's first family. This is a call to a more robust and honest faith, one that is not afraid of complexity, a faith that can hold both the profound theology of the fall and the historical details of a life lived in real time. To acknowledge the 7 years in the garden is to deepen our understanding of what was lost. To remember Awan and Azura is to restore the honor of the mothers from whom we all descend. Let this revelation be a catalyst for how you read all of sacred history. Dare to look for the missing timelines, the silenced voices, the details that were deemed too inconvenient for the final edit. Become an active participant in the story, not just a passive consumer. Question the summaries, seek out the unabridged versions, demand the director's cut. The story of Adam and Eve is not a simple fable. It is the complex, sometimes difficult, and ultimately beautiful story of our own family. It has been summarized and sanitized for too long. The choice now is to embrace the fullness of that story, to welcome back the characters who were written out, and to honor the time that was erased. The gatekeepers gave us a garden in a snow globe, a perfect, timeless, but ultimately contained world. The fuller testimony invites us into the real Eden, a place with seasons, with history, and with a family that looks a lot more like our own. Welcome to the unabridged story of the beginning.